Hey guys, I am Lauren Hollows, and today I am going to be talking to you about the history of vet. This is only about a 15-minute presentation, and it's the way that I like to kick off a lot of my full-day PD sessions because I love reflecting on the history of vocational education and training. We all have our unique histories of how we got into vocational education and training, but when we actually start to take a step back and reflect on where this kind of concept came from, I think it's really interesting because vocational education and training is quite different from traditional education. I like to talk about it when I talk to people. I kind of go, look, I'm all for, there's a big difference when we talk about, education and when we talk about skills, right? When we talk about vocational education and actual training, because training involves the doing. Whereas I think really when we look at the education side, we seem to be talking more about the mind. And so I always say, I'm happy for my kids to get sex education, but I'm not happy for them to get sex training. Training to me is really about getting those hands-on skills and getting in there and trying stuff and doing it. So to me, we've got education, which is kind of how we lay the foundations and we talk about the principles and everything like that. So that's the knowledge. And then we've got the skills, which is the training component of it. And I think it's interesting when we look back where it all started. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this is going to work. Yay, there we go. Okay, so as I said, look, this is only about a 15-minute presentation. At the end, I am going to link to that video up at the top there. That is from Sir Ken Robinson, who I absolutely adore. He was a massive influence in education. And I think if the education system had been modeled after his principles, we would see a very different model of education and we would actually see a very different society nowadays. So I will link to that at the end of it. But I'm going to go through this first. And so let's start at the beginning. And for most people, you might not really think about it, but to me, the vocational education and training sector started here. And this was around about 1750 BC, and it was with the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi. And in the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, it specifically stated that artisans had to teach their crafts to the youth. Okay, so artisans had to teach their craft to the youth. And they saw that as something that was a really strong pillar in their society, so strong that it actually needed to be noted down. We see similar records in Egypt, Greece, and Rome. They all kind of followed their suit. So there was a concept that we needed to impart our skills onto the young so that we could continue and create kind of this sustainable society in relationship to, an economic, labor, and education. And obviously, there is a very, very strong economic reason for why we, quote unquote, educate. So started in the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, continues on through Egypt, Greece, Rome, everything along those lines. And continues very much through that way, all the way through Europe. Use slightly different terminology. We then started to come up and we can't exactly, I'm not exactly sure the time, but between about the 1500s and the 1700s, we start to get this relationship of master and apprentice. So this is where the language starts to come in of there is a master and there is apprentice. And this is very much what it looked like for many, many hundreds of years. So it would be kind of, very young boys who would come and then learn their crafts from somebody who was more experienced. Okay. So this is actually from 1826, again, from the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, not a lot is actually changing. This is an 1826 apprentice indentureship contract for our young 12-year-old John Prosser. He is about to embark on a 7-year apprenticeship contract in the art, trade, and mystery of being a seaman. So again, fantastic language from this period. I want to bring that back, the art, trade, and mystery of being a bricklayer, and the art, trade, and mystery of being a chef. I just feel like, we would get a lot more interest from students if we use that sort of language. So, 7-year apprenticeship, indentureship, took them under their wing, and pretty much, as we said, from the age of 12 was pretty common for young boys back then. In the decades before and after the Second World War, we did start to see a more formal training component being introduced into the apprenticeship models. So this is a great book. It's from Alan Arthur Rawlinson, and it's his story of being a merchant navy apprentice. We do start to, so it's really only at this point, literally after, I don't know what, 400, 500, 600 years of, pretty much just doing that one-on-one model of apprentice and master, that we start to see things progressively institutionalized and strengthened. And obviously this is also coinciding with the point of time in history where we're starting to see a more industrialization of models and things like that. And so I guess rather than, this is where we start to see a slight change in industry from that economic perspective as well, of, needing more factory labor sorts of models. And so in kind, we then start to tweak our education models to be more institutionalized as well, because it's not about this one-on-one model so much anymore, is that we need to start developing these factory workers, because that's where the skills are then starting to move to. So apprentices at this point would typically spend a day a week in a technical college, or they would have an extended time in what was known as block release, which was just introduced a little bit later. In both of these models, apprentices would spend about 80% of their time learning in the workplace and 20% undertaking formal training at a technical college. So, going back from this time, these arrangements sought to ensure that an apprenticeship program covered all aspects of the trade, not just the part that was present in each workplace. Since most apprentices started their training after a limited number of years at secondary school, the curriculum for formal training also included a significant amount of general education. So this is where we start to see kind of, as I said, that we've got that merge happening, where we are including a lot of like formal and general education into the training, and therefore that's kind of what's then balancing it out. When we then look at it, so obviously we start to look at the models that we have now. We have our, we've obviously got our TAFEs and we've got our private sector. The term technical and further education, TAFE, was introduced in 1973 and was the precedent to vocational education and training. So, realistically, we're still looking at this time, 1970s, we've still very, very much got that same model of, that kind of 80-20 sort of a model in relationship to timeframes. Let's be honest, not a lot has changed since then anyway. 1994, we have the introduction of AVET-MIS. The AVET-MIS is established. And when we start to look at the numbers, so as I said, to me, our history goes back to the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, and it's the idea of a master teaching his craft to an apprentice, or an artisan teaching their craft to an apprentice. And we were very much, the history of VET is very, very strongly tied in with traineeships and apprenticeships, and in trade training, training in trade occupations, okay? So when we look at the 1970s, the breakdown of trade versus non-trade occupations, it's pretty much 100% all trade occupations leading up to pretty much the 1980s. And in the 1980s is only then is when we start to introduce some non-trade occupations into it. And obviously in the initial days, it was focused around things like, nursing, childcare, some of, chef and things like, well, not chef, but, some of the kind of hospitality sorts of things. They were all starting to be introduced around this stage. Very, very low levels of participation up until the mid-1990s. And it really is only from the 1990s that we start to see significant numbers. And it takes until around about 2006 before the numbers actually even out of like a balance of trade and non-trade training occupations. Over the next probably 10 years, what we see like currently is we see that that trade occupations number has probably like kind of tampered out or come down a little bit. Obviously, the non-trade occupations has continued to go up, but what we also see now is we see that a significant proportion of vocational education is actually happening in individual units, and it's happening in skill sets. So it's happening in a lot of these sort of add-on things. So I guess one of the areas where VET has changed is in the makeup or in that relationship to how we go about training the young in our crafts, and what the crafts look like. And that is, somewhat in response to, as I said, that economic argument. So what we have done is we've built an education system around meeting the economic needs. And so initially that was this kind of trade idea, and that literally lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. Then we had about probably 60 to 70 years where it was kind of this industrialization, and what we wanted was we needed a lot of factory workers. And so for factory workers, churning out these qualifications was really well suited. The challenge that we have now is that now what companies are looking for is companies are looking for individuals that are dynamic and that are adaptable and that are innovative and that are able to jump from area to area and are able to collaborate really strongly. And so this is where a lot of this individual units has come in, because people are taking their base trade and then they're doing kind of these add-on skill sets, or they're they're combining a range of skill sets in order to get to an outcome. So it's really interesting to see, I guess, in that aspect, the evolution of it and where we then go to from here. And obviously now we talk today about micro-credentialing and everything like that. Regulation takes effect and it hits our sector hard in 2012 with the introduction of the National Vocation Education Training Regulator, which was ASQA. New standards come in 2012, and they are strengthened again in 2015. And in 2015, this combines with the vet fee help scandal. And so I think this still has a really, really strong effect. So prior to this, so anyone who was in the sector prior to 2015 knew that really a lot of training and a lot of the focus of vocational education and training was very, very much on training. So it was about training and on imparting those skills. And there was a requirement to document that, and that started to be strengthened from 2012. But it hit hard in 2015 when all of a sudden there was this smattering of colleges that absolutely lambasted our sector in dragging our reputation down, because they weren't delivering skills, they weren't delivering training, and they were just sucking a huge amount of money from the government with all of the vet fee help scandals. And so all of a sudden the regulator had to make a fairly massive shift. And it was this massive shift to, if there is no evidence, there is no training occurring. Which even to this day, like, I think we need to recognize is not necessarily the case. I have been to colleges where there's been great training occurring and just a really poor understanding of what assessment is and how assessment can work and how we need to document the assessment that occurs. And sometimes the training and assessment component is there, and it's just the documentation component of it that really sucks. And so, then it's just a matter of switching to that. But unfortunately, as a result of that, a lot of our focus nowadays is more on the assessment component and on the evidencing component, as opposed to the training component. And that has then also resulted in a really hard loss to the sector of a lot of really good quality trainers. So then in 2018, 2019, we had a big changing of the guard. So at this point, David Garner stepped down from ASQA and he handed the reins over to Saxon Rice, who initially was just going to take the reins temporarily, but has been with ASQA ever since at the lead. And it was very much a signaling of a changing of the guard to a I guess, a kinder, gentler aspirant. I'm sure I'm going to have people that will comment and tell me that I'm completely wrong about this, but I'm speaking from my experience and experience of all of the RTOs that I've worked with over the last couple of years. It is a far more consultative arrangement, and it's one whereby the regulator is actually now going out and talking to trainers. And so the focus is on talking to trainers. What training do you do? What assessment do you do? What is your process for evidence collection? You know, how, like, we want to look at your policies and procedures, and yeah, that's kind of somewhat important. We want to look at your assessment tools, but really we want to look at how you apply your policies and procedures. We want to look at how you apply your assessment tools. We want to look at how you provide professional development for your teachers. We want to look at how you provide support for your students. Like, show us that support that you've provided to your students. Show us the evidence of competency that you've collected and how you've interpreted that it is actual evidence of competency. And so that changing of the guards was quite important, because it does mean that we've got a far more consultative regulator, which in my view is really, really positive. But it also means that we need to have trainers, and we need to have trainers who can speak the two languages. So we speak our language of our industry trades, but then we also need to speak the language of vets. So we need to be able to explain reliability. We need to be able to explain, validity, sufficiency, authenticity, currency, reliability, fairness, flexibility, and how we as trainers apply all of these things in our daily practice. And so, this is language that is very, very much fallen out of a lot of trainers' vocabulary when trainers move from doing, the training, the curriculum development, the assessment. We were, for very many years, certainly when I got into it, we were the one-stop shop. It was like, go and teach, you're teaching this unit to now. And I was like, hey, cool, where's the resources? Well, there are no resources, like, just go and do it. And so you had to come up with the training materials, you had to come up with the activities, you had to come up with the assessments, and you kind of, you just had to, you had to do all of that by yourself. Whereas now that a lot of that area is outsourced, but what it means is that trainers are, to a large extent, you are a trainer and an evidence collector. And so, that changes the dynamics of how you engage with the sector as a whole. So that changing of the guards was quite important. It had a lot of positives that came along with it, but it also, I guess, required this update of skills. So I'm going to leave you with this video here. I do strongly recommend that you guys actually watch this. It is Sir Ken Robinson, Changing Paradigms. It's a brilliant video. It's only about 11 minutes. But it does really clearly articulate some of the challenges that our sector faces in relationship to understanding the challenges that students go through nowadays, and understanding how we need to look at changing from being an education, how we go from dealing with this kind of institutionalization for industrialization to adapting education for the future. I hope you found this interesting. I love talking about the history of VET. I'm very excited to see where the future of VET goes, and I hope you guys all have an awesome day. Now I just need to figure out how to stop this. Bye, guys.